Good evening, good afternoon. This is the third day of my salute to Black history as I go about reading the Equal Justice Initiative Reconstruction in America, where we're looking at the violence that followed our freedom in 1867. We're on chapter 3, documenting that Reconstruction violence, known and unknown horrors. The freemen here have been kept in the perfect terror of their lives by desperate men of the county who are hostile and active and abusive, assailing and murdering this inoffensive people all over the county for any and every pretext that human ingenuity can devise, and often without any plea whatever. A Freeman Bureau official in Sherman, Texas, October of 1866. So how can you celebrate Juneteenth when you were in perfect terror of your life for practicing that freedom? In this chapter, 34 documented mass lynchings during the Reconstruction era and racial terror and Reconstruction, a state snapshot. The historical record is filled with scattered but consistent and devastating descriptions of the terror and brutality that followed what should have been a time of hope and promise. Despite the plentiful reports from observers describing the frequent and largely unchecked murders and assaults Black people suffered during the Reconstruction period of 1865 to 1876, there is no established casualty count or reliable total number of victims killed. Quantitative documentation of the violence of this era remains imprecise and incomplete. In his foundational book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, historian Leon F. Lidwick acknowledges several reasons for the sparse record. For one, Southern newspapers often suppress reports of white violence targeting Black people, alleging that the stories unfairly cast the South in a bad light. In addition, the boldness and impunity with which these attacks were committed meant that many victims simply disappeared, leaving no obvious trace of their fate. The trauma of racial violence also left many Black victims and witnesses afraid to report attacks or provide testimony against the white mobs responsible. And finally, the indifference and even the complicity of local legal systems left few authorities to whom attacks could be reported, even if people, our brothers and sisters, our ancestors, were brave enough to do so. Whether dealing with the slaves or freemen, Southern courts and jurists seldom wavered from the urgent need to solidify white supremacy, ensure proper discipline in Blacks, and punish severely those who violated the racial code. After this initial experience with the judicial system, many Black men found little reason to place any confidence in it. The law discredited or discriminated against them. The courts upheld the double standard of justice, and the police acted as enforcers. Today, newspaper articles, summary records gathered and preserved by the federally organized Freeman Bureau, and testimony taken during congressional hearing accounts for most surviving narratives of white violence targeting Black people within the first years after the Civil War. Those records provide only a partial list of the total Black victims killed and assaulted in acts of racial violence during this period. But a review of these records paints a haunting and devastating picture of a period of deadly attacks that yielded thousands of documented victims and terrorized Black communities across the South with near daily acts of lynching and assaults. The Freeman Bureau records are the most comprehensive and reliable official accounting of Reconstruction violence against Black people, but they are not without limitations. records of murders and outrages digitized and transcribed online only 1865 to 1868, while those covering later years remain in archives awaiting consolidation and processing. Thorough review of those 1865 to 1868 records, congressional testimony, and newspaper reports from the era of the Equal Justice Initiative have documented more than 2,000 black victims killed during the Reconstruction era from 1865 to 1867. This is a staggering figure compared to the more than 4,000 victims documented for the 74-year era of racial terror lynchings that spanned 1877 to 1950. It is an even more horrific figure considering the thousands of additional victims who may be documented in other records or who are undocumented and forever lost to history. The complete data now available should not be used to derive trends or comparative rankings, but aggregating these known numbers can make the terror of this period more tangible by painting a picture of the widespread nature of the violence and the ways attacks were often concentrated in time and space. There is a figure 1, which identifies the counties in which the Equal Justice Amendment's current records document acts of racial violence. During Reconstruction that were reported to the Freeman's Bureau or documented in news coverage from the era. The map clearly illustrates that violence was concentrated in the South and touched most counties in the region, but also stretched to the Midwest and North. This map will represent a minimum rather than a maximum. Because records are scattered and incomplete, the lack of documentation of violence in a particular county does not mean that black people in those counties were not targeted for whippings, shootings, rapes, lynchings, and other acts of racial violence. Figure 2 shows 34 documented massacres during the Reconstruction era in which white mobs attacked black communities and killed 3 or more people in one act of racial violence. In some cases, the estimated death tolls reached 100 or more victims. These massacres took place in the South and were frequently waged by white mobs seeking to brutally suppress the black vote or to instill fear and terror in the entire black community by killing alleged suspects accused of unproven crimes. Even as we examine the information we glean from the aggregate data, the limitations of this approach cannot be overstated. How many black men and women were beaten, flogged, mutilated, and murdered in the first years of the emancipation will never be known, Dr. Ledwood observed, nor can any accurate body count or statistical breakdown reveal the barbarity and depravity that so frequently characterized the assaults made on Freeman in the purported name of restraining their savagery and depravity. The severed ears and the entrails, the mutilated sex organs, the burning at the stake, the forced drownings, the open display of skulls and limbs as trophy. To acknowledge and understand the human toll and devastating terror wrought by attacks that targeted black people during this hopeful and fearful era, we must go beyond the incomplete numbers to learn about the stories that have survived and to contemplate the many that have not. 34 documented mass lynchings during the Reconstruction era. It is certain that many more mass lynching events than those listed here took place during the Reconstruction era, and it is likely that hundreds or thousands of more people, black people, were killed in mass violence during this period that can be documented today. Mobile County, Alabama, 1865. White mobs kill an estimated 138 black people over the course of several months. Dublin County, North Carolina, 1865. 6 black men lynched after demanding that a white landowner pay them for their work. Memphis, Tennessee, 1865. Approximately 20 black Union officers attacked and killed. Bell County, Texas, 1866. Violent attacks by the Ku Klux Klan leave approximately 7 black people dead. Pine Bluff, Arkansas, March of 1866. 24 emancipated black women, men, and children living in a refugee camp are found dead hanging from trees. Memphis, Tennessee, May of 1866. White mobs attacked the black community, killing at least 46 people and destroying homes, schools, churches, and businesses. New Orleans, Louisiana, July of 1866. White mobs attack advocates marching for black voting rights, killing an estimated 33 black people. Milliken, Texas, July of 1868. An estimated 150 black people were killed by armed white mobs. Camellia, Georgia, September of 1868. White mobs attacked black residents gathered to protest political disenfranchisement, killing at least 7 black people. Opelousas, Louisiana, September of 1868. An estimated 200 black people are killed over several days after attempting to participate in the political process. Caddo Parish, Louisiana, October of 1868. At least 53 black people were killed by white mobs wielding racial violence to suppress the black vote. New Orleans, Louisiana, October of 1868. White mobs attack and kill 14 black men on Canal Street. St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, October of 1868. White mobs attack a black community to discourage voting, killing at least 35 black people. Algiers, New Orleans, Louisiana, October of 1868. White mobs used violence to suppress the black vote, killing at least 7 black people. Bossier Parish, Louisiana, October of 1868. White mobs terrorized the black community in widespread attacks leading up to Election Day, killing at least 162 black people. McDuffie County, Georgia, November of 1868. A black man named Paris Jeffries, his wife, and 4 of their sons are attacked and lynched by white mobs targeting Mr. Jeffries for voting. Moore County, North Carolina, February of 1869. After a black man named Daniel Blue testifies against white men accused of racial violence, a white mob attacks his home and lynches his wife and 5 children. Henderson, Texas, April of 1869. A white mob hangs 5 black men, including 2 preachers, on the public square outside the court without a trial. Tiptonville, Tennessee, November of 1869. White mob seizes 5 black men from jail and lynches them without a trial. Utah, Alabama, November of 1870. White mobs attack a political meeting of black residents and white allies, killing 4 black people. Harrodsburg, Kentucky, August of 1870. White mobs violently suppressed the black vote, lynching 4 black people. Union County, South Carolina, 1871. White mobs lynch up to 12 men during the rampant Klan terrorism. And of course, we read about this one on the Black Man's Read Aloud Hour, the entire event, the Colfax Massacre. Colfax, Louisiana, April of 1873. White mobs kill at least 150 black people in violence intended to disenfranchise black voters and restore white supremacy. Grand Parish, Louisiana, November of 1873. White mob lynches 6 black men without a trial. Bryan, Texas, March of 1874. White mob lynches 6 black men without a trial. Trenton, Tennessee, August of 1874. White mob abducts 16 black men from jail and lynches them without a trial. New Orleans, Louisiana, September of 1874. 3 days of violence leaves 11 dead after White League terrorist organization attempts to overthrow the Louisiana Reconstruction government in the so-called Battle of Liberty Place. Eufaula, Alabama, November of 1874. Armed white men attack black voters on the polls at Election Day, killing at least 6 black people. Vicksburg, Mississippi, December of 1874, when black residents organized to protest the removal of an elected black sheriff. White mobs attacked and killed an estimated 50 black people. Clinton, Mississippi, armed white mobs attacked the black community after a political meeting, killing an estimated 50 black people. West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, May of 1876, white mobs lynched at least 17 black people in violent effort to suppress the black vote. Edgerton County, South Carolina, May of 1876, white mob lynches 6 black men without a trial. Hamburg, South Carolina, July of 1876. In violence leading up to the election day, white mobs attacked black men stationed at the National Guard Armory, killing at least 6. East Valencia Parish, Louisiana, 1875 through 1876. White mobs lynched at least 30 black people in racialized attacks over several months. Racial Terror and Reconstruction, a state snapshot, Alabama. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 200 Reconstruction-era victims of Alabama racial violence, including those lynched, assaulted, raped, or killed throughout the state, including victims killed in massacres in Mobile, Balboa, and Greene counties. Perpetrators and supporters of this violence were never prosecuted. Some went on to hold elective office, including Governor George Houston, for whom Houston County is named, and Governor Braxton Bragg, Coma, Arkansas. After the Civil War's end, many black people who fled slavery during the war were homeless, living in abandoned Union camps or makeshift settlements. In March of 1866, after a disagreement between former Confederate soldiers and emancipated black people living in a refugee camp near Pine Bluff, the camp was burned down and 24 men, women, and children were found dead, hanging from trees. Delaware. In 1865, Delaware legislators refused to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and Governor Groves Salisbury declared that black people were a subordinate race. In 1867, black Union veteran William Obey Evans was lynched in Lipsick in Kent County, Delaware, after being accused of burning down a white man's barn. Later reports acknowledge his likely innocence. Florida. Many black men killed in Reconstruction violence in Florida were targeted for exercising their political rights. In Columbia County in 1869, a politically active black man named Leisha Johnson was abducted by a white mob and never seen again, though his hat, his shoes, and clothes were found in the woods. The next year in the same county, another black man named Robert Jones was shot and killed in his home after a white man threatened him for voting for pro-Reconstruction candidates. Georgia. In Georgia, the site of extensive racial violence during Reconstruction, the Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 300 acts of murder and other attacks, including the November 1868 massacre of Perry Jeffries, his wife, and 4 sons in McDuffie County. After learning that Mr. Jeffries or Jeffers planned to vote for presidential candidate Ulysses S. Grant, white mobs attacked the family, hanged Mrs. Jeffries, and shot and burnt 1 son. Days later, they seized Mr. Jeffries and 3 sons from a train as they tried to flee and shot them to death in the woods. Illinois. In February of 1874, after a white woman was robbed and killed in Carbondale, a black man named Charles Wyatt, deemed suspicious for spending a $20 bill, was arrested for the crime. As a lynch mob of over 400 white men gathered, authorities moved Mr. Wyatt to Murfreesboro, but the mob followed, seized Mr. Wyatt from jail, and hanged him without a trial. Indiana. In 1871, George Johnstone, Squire Taylor, and a man identified only by the surname Davis were lynched in Clark County. A mob of about 70 white men hanged the 3 black men from the same tree after they were accused of killing a white family. Soon after the men were lynched without trial, the press reported evidence that they were innocent. Iowa. In 1850, just 4 years after Iowa became a state, its legislature passed a law banning settlements by free black people, mirrored after an act that the territorial legislation had passed in 1839. Radical state legislatures managed to repeal the law in 1864, but that same year, Iowa's legislative majority rejected a proposed bill to extend voting rights to black men. Kansas, Luke Barnes, James Ponder, and Lee Watkins, 3 black men, were arrested and accused of killing a white man in Ellis County, Kansas in 1869 before they could be tried or defended. A white mob seized the men from jail and hanged them from the trestle of the nearby railroad, where they were found dead the next morning. Kentucky. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented racial violence in at least 37 Kentucky counties. On Election Day in 1870, violence broke out in Harrodsburg, Mercer County, as white men, angered by the presence of black voters supporting the pro-construction candidates, clashed with black crowds. 1 white man and 4 black people were killed, and 15 to 20 black people were wounded. Louisiana. During Reconstruction, Louisiana was the site of repeated massacres in places like Colfax, Opelousas, New Orleans, St. Bernard Parish, Orleans Parish, and West Valencia Parish that killed hundreds of black people and traumatized countless more in order to suppress black voting rights. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 1,000 lynchings and other incidents of racial violence in Louisiana during the 12-year Reconstruction period. This exceeds the number of racial terror lynchings documented in the state during the 80-year period that followed Reconstruction. Maryland. The border state of Maryland did not join the Confederacy, but it legally permitted slavery until November 1st, 1864, when its new state constitution went into effect. Although the state constitution marked the legal end of slavery, the last enslaved people were not likely freed until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. During Reconstruction, Maryland was the site of violent and sometimes deadly racial terror. In Harford County alone, a black man named Isaac Moore was lynched in 1868, and a black man named Jim Quinn was lynched in 1869. Michigan. In March of 1863, just 2 months after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, white mobs in Detroit, Michigan, angered by the growing migration of Freeman to the city and outraged by the trial of a mixed-race man accused of assault, waged violent attacks on the city's black community, killing at least 1 black man and leaving hundreds of black people homeless. Anti-black violence continued in the state during Reconstruction, including the 1868 lynching of John Taylor near Lansing, Michigan. Mississippi. During Reconstruction, black people in Mississippi were targets of repeated massacres, including in Vicksburg in December of 1874, when white mobs attacked and killed at least 50 black citizens who had organized to protest the removal of their elected black sheriff, Mr. Peter Cosby. Many black people were lynched in Missouri during the Reconstruction era, including George Bryan in Livingston County in 1873, Edmund Moore in Charleston County in 1875, and Raphael Williams in Platte County in 1876. New York. In the midst of the Civil War, New York voters elected Horatio Seymour, the white man's candidate and a strong supporter of Southern slavery. A year later, a mob of up to 3,000 people lynched a black man named Robert Mulliner in Newburgh. Weeks later, white mobs resentful of the Union draft attacked and killed dozens of black people in the New York City draft riots. North Carolina. The Ku Klux Klan and other white mobs exacted assault and murder at the slightest allegation during this era. In 1869, in Orange County, after a young black man named Wright Woods was accused of expressing interest in a young white woman, 4 white men abducted Mr. Woods from work. He was missing for nearly a week before a neighbor found vultures surrounding his hanging corpse. A note attached to his foot reportedly read, "If the law will not protect virtue, the rope will." Ohio. In 1865, Ohio voters elected Jacob Dawson Cox, a Union Army general who supported Andrew Johnson's limited view of Reconstruction and opposed enforcing voting rights for black people in the South. In 1876, a mob of 50 white men lynched a black man identified only by the name Ure in Urbana-Champaign County, Oregon. Oregon's 1857 Constitution banned black people from living in the state and aimed to prevent the mass migration of freemen if and when slavery was abolished in the South. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, invalidated this ban, but the state did not officially repeal it until 1926. Pennsylvania. Though Pennsylvania began legally abolishing slavery in 1780, the 1860 census was the first to document no enslaved black people residing within the state, and the issue of racial equality remained controversial during and after the Civil War. In 1871, white mobs in Philadelphia terrorized black communities on Election Day to discourage voting and killed at least 3 black men. In 1874, a black man named Albert Brown was lynched in Bradford County, South Carolina. In 1860, South Carolina was only 2 states in the nation with more enslaved residents than free. It was also the first state to secede from the Union in 1861, and like much of the South, ended the war grimly determined that freedom would not substantially alter the condition of former slaves. Racial violence by the Klan and other white mobs grew so widespread and deadly during Reconstruction that an attractive federal investigation led to the passage of the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act and caused President Ulysses Grant to declare martial law later that year. In Abbeville County alone, Freeman Bureau records documented 77 acts of racial violence against black people within 7 months in 1868, which amounts to a whipping, a rape, and shooting and lynching once every 3 days. Tennessee, the Equal Justice Amendment has documented more than 200 incidents of racial violence in Tennessee during Reconstruction, including the 1866 Memphis Massacre and the 1874 lynching of 16 black men in Trenton, Gibson County. Just weeks after the war's end, white men attacked and killed 20 black Union soldiers in Memphis on May 1st, 1865, based on doubtful rumors that black men were planning to attack white Confederate veterans who had massacred black soldiers at Fort Pillow during the war. Texas. Lynchings and other violence documented in Texas during the Reconstruction era spanned more than 45 counties and include a deadly massacre in Brazos County, the community of Milligan, in 1868. That July, after a local black preacher began organizing Milligan black community to defend itself against the growing threat of Klan violence, Klansmen fired on a group of black people investigating a rumored lynching. Over the next 2 days, hundreds of white men from neighboring towns terrorized the local black community, and dozens more black victims were killed. Scholars today estimated that 150 black people were killed, but the exact death toll remains unknown. Virginia. In 1869, a mob of white men abducted 2 black men named Jacob Bryan and Charles Brown from a jail and hanged them without a trial. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 120 incidents of Reconstruction-era racial violence in 40 Virginia counties, even more than the number of racial terror lynchings documented in the state between 1877 and 1950. West Virginia. In 1874, a mob of 20 white men abducted and lynched a black man named John Taliaferro from jail in Martinsburg, Berkeley County. News of his death was reported under a headline, "A Sample of Southern Justice." Wisconsin. In 1861, a young black man named George Marshall Clark was lynched in Milwaukee after he and another black man were accused of getting into a drunken fight with 3 white men who were also intoxicated. After one of the white men died from the injuries, a mob of up to 50 white men seized Mr. Clark from jail and hung him. Mr. Clark's companion was later tried, acquitted, and smuggled out of the city to avoid the same fate. And that's the end of chapter 3 of today's Salute to Black History, Equal Justice initiatives documenting racial reconstruction violence. Take care. Join me tomorrow.